Hi, I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California, and welcome to the Forum Online. It's Pride Month, and while there won't be a Pride again this year, a parade in San Francisco this year, although I think they're going to change their minds about it. I think there's going to be some informal parade, even if the formal parade doesn't happen. There's still so much to celebrate, and there's still much work to be done, healing to be done, and the struggle for true equality and acceptance for LGBTQ plus people. I'm very proud to be joined tonight by Kim Jackson. She's a state senator from District 41 in Georgia. She's an Episcopal priest, and with her spouse, Trina, a lifelong advocate for social justice and getting things done. Kim, thank you so much for joining me. I know you must be so busy there with both your pastoral commitments and your political commitments. So we're really grateful that you take the time for us tonight and to be with us together. I'm really, really grateful for it.
All right.
I wonder if you can start just a little bit about just how you celebrate Pride. I mean, were there any particular Pride moments that you remember from your life that you want to share with us tonight?
Yeah, so I will always remember my very first Pride parade. So just for background, I grew up in a small rural town in South Carolina. I don't think they have a Pride parade even still. Like that's not a thing. But when I moved to Atlanta, I was 22 years old, and it just kind of come out. And that was so our Pride in Atlanta now is in October because June is extraordinarily hot. But this was one of the last times when it was in June and it was pouring rain, like just a horrendous, rainstorm. And still thousands of people were there for the parade. And I just remember standing there, and because it was raining, people couldn't tell that I was crying, but I was just weeping it was the first time I'd been in a space where people were out and they were proud about it. And there were other people around them who loved them, right? They were like all these allies who had these signs of like, we love you. And there were moms out there who had signs that said, we love you. And so it was life-changing, I think, for me all those years ago. And I continue to go every year to our Pride Parade because that was such a pivotal moment in my own life.
Yeah, even as you're speaking, it's bringing tears to my eyes, thinking just about how many people have had similar experiences. And even just, we gathered in church for in-person worship. We haven't been worshiping in person indoors in so long. And it's just like the organist will play something on the piano, and just start weeping, because there we are, people who I love and people I miss so much, and to really be together again. I think that's part of what I love so much about church, is that like the people I find in church are just sustain me and help me to keep going, and come from all different walks of life, all different ways of doing things, and find a way to support each other.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your childhood and just like what that was like growing up in a rural area. I used to work on farms and ranches when I was a teenager, and it's a really different experience being in the middle of the city now. And I wonder if you can just talk about that, just making that adjustment from a childhood, which is kind of in a more rural place, and how that's formed you.
Yeah, so I grew up in a little town called Cowpen, South Carolina. And it was, literally a one stoplight town. I mean, I remember when they put in the stoplight, it was a four-way, like flashing light at first. And it's called Cowpen, Cowpens, because we have cows. People raise beef, cattle out in the country. But, I grew up right down the street from my grandparents. And so I could walk to my grandparents' house every day after school. And my cousins, we all kind of lived in the same general area. And so it was a very close family and a very religious, deeply religious family. So I grew up going to church every time the doors were open. I went to a little black country church with the hardwood floors where we would pat our feet, and every time the doors were open, we were there. And I think that's where I really began to have the true formation and grounding of what it means to love God. And the other piece of that of my childhood is that my grandfather had Alzheimer's pretty much my entire childhood. And he would come to our house and I would play the piano for him. And he would just sit in the living room and I would play these old hymns. And I don't remember a single time in my life where he knew who I was. Like he did not know my name. He didn't know my mom's name, who was his daughter, but he knew every single word of those hymns that I would play.
Yeah.
And that was just such a profound experience for me as a young person, as a kid, to see the ways that, like, the human brain is really, really incredible, right? But
Yeah.
there's somewhere like locked inside of his brain, and I would even say in his soul, were those songs that really fed him and shaped him. And so I think that's been my real spiritual grounding, has come from sitting on that piano bench and listening to my grandfather sing those hymns.
Yeah, my grandparents lived in the small town that I was in too, and they lived across the street from the high school. I'd go visit them all the time. But that experience, there's so many times when I visited people in the hospital, and people think they can't talk, and you start saying the Lord's Prayer, and it's deep in us. And that's why I think so often we got to be careful about what we plant in us. Do you know what I mean? Because you can plant things that are so deep in you, and they can be like Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. Or it can be like, I'm not worthy, or I never belonged here, or my parents never liked me as much as my sister. We have to be careful about the seeds we plant in ourselves. But I love that the image of you playing the piano. What other kinds of things were you interested in as a teenager? Did you see signs as you were a teenager of just like your political future and or either of your church future?
Yeah, I did. So actually, I knew that I was called to ministry when I was just 8 years old. And because of the context in which I grew up, I went to the pastor. So I grew up in like a Black Baptist church, right? So at 8, I go to him and I say, hey, I want to, like, I feel called to ministry. And he responded, girls can't do that. To which I responded, not actually trying to be smart. Like, I responded very genuinely, not while I'm a girl, of course not. But because when I become a woman,
Right, exactly.
you know,
Uh,
um, and he explained to me that, women in that tradition were not allowed to be pastors. And so I just I let it go. And it wasn't until I went to college that I began to imagine something different for my life and return to that calling. But also when I was about 13, I feel like I am like the poster child for, people who take young people out to go on like trips to learn about the world. I'm the poster child for that because, I was a part of a group of young, gifted kids who were taken to learn about public service at 13. And we visited firefighters and police officers. And, we saw all these ways that, kind of government works. And then we ended the night at the city council meeting. And the city council meeting was for the next town next door. And they had their first Black mayor who was serving and presiding over that council. And I had the light bulb moment, that metaphorical light bulb moment where I knew I want to run for office someday. I knew it in that exact moment that I didn't know necessarily the where or the when or even how you get to that place, but I knew that the what of my life was that I wanted to make positive change in the world, and elected office was one of the ways you could do it.
Wow, I love that story. I was the same thing in our high school. They choose one boy and one girl to go with the lawyers, like the Lawyers Guild, and spend the day like learning about the law and lawyers. And it was actually, that made me not want to be a lawyer. Actually, I saw the way they're kind of teasing each other. I guess I was too young to understand just like adult banter. I was a junior in high school, and but I just didn't like the vibe of the particular group that I was in. But I mean, in the legislature, there are a tremendous number of lawyers, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like how that creates a kind of culture, and then also what, just like having a religious leader in an elected body like that, what special gifts a religious leader might bring to a kind of elected body like the Georgia State Senate.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We do have a lot of attorneys who are in the room and who are really, really smart and understand policy. And I feel like I'm kind of like a little sleeper cell in the room, because they assume, I'm clergy, so I probably don't understand policy, but like I know how to read really well.
Right, completely.
And I will say, this is like shout out to, theological education, the ways that we learn how to explore and dig deeply into scripture, and how we bring like a hermeneutic of suspicion, all of the exegesis that we learn how to do in seminary for scripture I can apply that to the law quite well. And so it's actually really cool to do that work with them. But I will say, I'm in the South, and so there are a number of clergy who were there. Now, I'm not the only one, but I am the only one who's full-time vocationally clergy, and that does make a difference, right? So people call me Rev, even the Republicans. When I get up to speak in the well, there's some expectation that I will be calling us to our better selves. And I think people respect that and are open to hearing it, even if we are on different sides of the aisle.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been in different places. Different places have different cultures of how they deal with people, religious people. And it's good for all of us to kind of, for me to get out of San Francisco, where there's kind of one perspective on clergy, and my wife's native Hawaiian, and Hawaii is just a totally different world for what it's like to be clergy there. But talk more about seminary. Like how did you get there? Like, what was your favorite class or favorite professor? I totally agree with you. You're taught to read things in a very close way, and of course that would be a tremendous benefit as you're serving the public.
Yeah, so I got to seminary because I had a college chaplain who saw gifts of ministry in me my freshman year and came to me, and he actually approached me and said, Kim, I think you might have a calling to ministry. And I replied, I can't do it. I'm a woman. And he put me in his car. I mean, this is, such a powerful moment. And it really, I think, I've had these we all have these points in our life where we know like something is changing, something's turning for us. And this was a turning moment for my life when he put me in his car and he introduced me to women in Greenville, South Carolina, who were serving as clergy. They had churches and like they were pastors, and it blew my mind. I'd never seen a woman who was doing that work. I'd never seen like particularly like a Black woman doing that work. And he introduced me to those folks. And so that really planted the seed, or replanted perhaps, or I guess maybe he was watering that seed that had been planted inside of me all those years ago to explore it. And so, when I graduated from college, it just, first of all, I graduated with a history degree, so you can kind of only go to grad school with that. So I knew like this is seminary is where I want to be, and I knew that I would have to find a new kind of denominational home and things like that. But I felt with great certainty that this was the next place for me, was seminary, and it was. I mean, seminary was really great for me. I don't. It's interesting you asked me like what class was my favorite. I don't know. Seminary was not great for me because of the education per se. It was great for this much larger, I learned about social justice and theology. I learned about the intersections of what it means to be a person who brings your faith to the public square. I don't even know if that was a class. Like, I think that was kind of the ethos of the place. It's where I first got introduced to issues of justice, particularly around criminal justice reform and the death penalty specifically. My classmates and I really rallied around some people who were scheduled to be executed then. And so it was, I think it was the class as in terms of the students and the professors and what they stood for, and less in, a specific class, there's no lecture that stands out as like, oh, that was the moment, right? That didn't happen.
Yeah, I try to explain to people what it's like too. But you're right. What happens out of the classroom is just tremendously important, and it's just really hard to get your finger on it because it's not like one thing. It's we had the person who had the most promise of everybody I knew in seminary, and I'm still disappointed to this day. We had a lot of LGBTQ plus people who were getting ordained, but he was from Arkansas, and there was no way for him, and there was enough roadblocks, so he just got deterred a little bit. And he's had a great career doing incredible social justice work and prison reform, but he was the best of us. Mm-hmm. And I learned, you're right, I learned as much from him, John Treat, as I learned from my professors, and he's out there somewhere in the world, doesn't even know that I think about him all the time.
Yeah. Well, that's the other thing that I will add. So, I arrived in Atlanta to go to seminary. I'm this young Black girl who grew up in the country with the only Black professionals I knew were Black professionals in my family, and the Black dentist in town. And so I moved to Atlanta, where I remember calling my mom from I was on the bus. Emory has a little bus that takes people around. And I call my mom and I'm like, there are Black doctors on this bus with me. I'm like, it was mind blowing. And just, I think, so important for me. But then also when I got to Candler, there were these out LGBTQ folks who were very clear about their sexual orientation and also very clear about their call. And I hadn't quite gotten there when I first arrived. I was still pretty much in the closet, still trying to pray the gay away a bit. And so when I met, the student body president was an out queer woman. And so it was just really helpful to have those models for me, and models of courage, because I went to seminary. I went to a Methodist seminary where United Methodists, I think they still don't ordain out clergy, right?
Yeah.
But they certainly weren't doing that 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so these folks were incredibly brave and bold about, who they were, and clear about God's call on their lives as queer people.
Yeah. Yeah. You're so right. It's such a powerful community. And I think we were so fortunate. I think if I'd been 10 years earlier, the whole scene would have been entire. Well, I knew the first woman who received tenure on our faculty. She's a close friend of mine still. So she's still alive. It's so much was happening so quickly. And I definitely feel like I was the beneficiary from that for sure. Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just kind of what it was like to start serving churches when you were done with seminary. And then I'd love you to share us a little bit about the Church of the Common Ground. I've seen other ministries in other urban areas that are like that, and I'd love to know more about what it is that you're up to.
Yeah. So when I finished, I did an extra Anglican year at Virginia Seminary just to get properly indoctrinated.
I should have done that. That would have helped me so much if I'd done that.
I lament it every month of those 9 months, but it actually has turned out to be really, really helpful.
Because you know what a tippet is now. And someone says tippet, I'm just like, was that the thing then?
Not only do I know what it is, I own one.
Oh, you have your own tippet?
Yes. So, I went to Virginia, and then when I finished, I returned to Atlanta to be a college chaplain, which, given my story, should not actually be all that surprising. But for the first 5 years of my priesthood, I had the great privilege and honor of serving as the Episcopal chaplain at the Atlanta University Center, which is the world's largest consortium of historically Black colleges and universities. And so it was just I was 25. So my students were really close to my age. I always tell them, you all could be my little brothers, because most of them are from Morehouse. But it was just this beautiful space for me to really explore and to talk about how do you bring theology to whatever it is that you're called to? How do you bring your faith? Because, I'm working with, at the time, a lot of first generation African-American college students. So everybody who came to chapel with me was going to be a lawyer or a doctor. That's how they all started.
Right.
And so, I got to practice with them talking about, what does it mean to be a faithful lawyer? What does it mean to be a faithful doctor? And also, what does it mean to faithfully follow a call that may not be one of those two vocations? And so it was some of the best times of my clergy life, was being able to serve and walk alongside those young people who are now, grown, and not all of them are lawyers and doctors. They're doing all kinds of wonderful things in the world. And then I served in a traditional congregation, a traditional church, for a couple of years, a downtown big steeple, kind of 3,000 member parish. And after I decided to run for office, I found a job that was a little more fitting for both my call and for this kind of bivocational life that I'm living, which is where I work at the Church of the Common Ground. And Common Ground is a church without walls. I tell people, they ask me where is your church? And I'm like, it's outside, literally, it's outside. But they're like, what? But wait, where? So we meet in a park for Sunday worship, and then we do programming throughout the week. But I tell people 90% of my congregants will sleep outside tonight. and then we'll gather together for morning prayer in the morning and share coffee and pastoral care. And we really seek to be a spiritual home. I'm not a social worker. That's not what we do. We connect people to social workers. We connect people to resources. But we're church in that sense that we provide a spiritual home. I do pastoral care. I visit them when they're in prison or when they're in, in the hospital, right? I do all the things that you do, Malcolm,
Yeah.
but with people who live outside.
Yeah. That's such a powerful ministry. When I was, in seminary, I served a church which had a huge ministry for everywhere I went in the city. I'd know people, because there are always people who are outside and they know me by name. And it was, it may not meant I really felt at home in that place.
Yeah.
I definitely did.
It is really it's interesting. So a lot of the people that I serve and I'm in ministry with live across the street from the Capitol. And so when I'm walking down the street with my Capitol colleagues, and we're in our our suits and the finery and all that, and then I have they're mostly men, right, who come up to me. They're like, "Hey, Mother Kim," and they like to do it because they like to see the reaction of the people standing beside me, and they'll tell other senators. They'd be like, "This is my senator. This is my senator."
That's great. I love that. I love that. So tell me about a little bit about just how your political dreams came true. I mean, I love the idea of you going on that program when you're in high school and just recognizing the possibilities of transforming society through the democratic process. But tell us a little bit about just how you decided to run, and just maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the campaign was like, just because that must have been just a crazy experience.
Yeah. So my wife and I've been married for 10 years legally. We flew to Iowa. I tell people we eloped, but really we went to a state where it was legal,
Yeah.
and for 10 years, but we've been together for about 13. And she reminds me that I told her on the second date, just a heads up, I'm going to be a pastor and I'm going to run for office. So,
That's
so we've been
great.
preparing for this for quite some
Yeah.
time. And the time was just right. I'd been doing a lot of work at the Capitol already as an advocate, and done a lot of work around women's issues and making sure that we take care of rape kits in Georgia, count them and process them, and help give people a chance to kind of get some justice in the world. So I've been doing that work as a pastor and a priest. And so when the seat came open, the time was just right. And if I had known there was going to be a pandemic, I don't know that I would have said the time was right. um, but that's how it worked out. So I was telling you, before the webinar formally started, I began my campaign pretty traditionally, knocking on doors and doing meet and greets in people's homes and all that. And then when the pandemic happened, I had to shift everything to Zoom. And as I said earlier, the only people who go to meet and greets are the people who don't actually know how to use Zoom.
I love that. That's great.
So I spend the first 30 minutes of every meet and greet just calling people on the phone, okay, press this button, press this. We actually created a team of people who would help to kind of support folks with the technology. And it actually was a real gift. I can't tell you how many of my constituents have thanked me for taking the time to teach them how to use Zoom, because as we know, that has become the way that we communicate with the world. And so they were really grateful for that introduction and the ability to communicate with their kids and do all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's so funny. We had a candidate for the Democratic presidential primary from our congregation, and talk about like a thankless task. I mean, it's just going from town to town, from state to state, television. It was exhausting. And every time I talked to the guy, he was just completely energized by it, because he loved, he said, I got to understand America in a way that I just never could have any other way. And I wonder if you could talk about just what you learned about your own district as you were campaigning and in your new role. I mean, there's a way in which you're responsible for everybody in a way that most people don't experience.
Yeah, so I've learned so much about my district, and the people particularly. So I happen to have in my district a city that has been a refugee resettlement site for the last 15 or so years. And so just down the road from me, a couple of miles, I have 80 different languages spoken
Wow.
in that kind of 1 square mile. Every religion major and every major religion certainly is represented within that group of folks, and a lot of other religions as well that are not necessarily part of that kind of major canopy. And I also learned, I mean, so we are in theory an urban area. I mean, what I serve, like when people think about, like, I serve Atlanta, but I actually serve the outskirts of Atlanta. We are not as urban as we thought we were, and I learned that as a result of campaigning and going out into these like country fields where people have, I mean, I have 5 acres, but people have like acres and acres of land, and they have horses and they have cows. I'm like, wow, I'm back in cow pens.
Right.
And I just had no idea that part, existed in metro Atlanta, right? Like, I just had no idea. And so being able to talk to, country white folks who, are raising horses about their issues when we went and knocked on their doors was a real treat. We have a lot of poverty, and we also have a lot of great wealth. And Atlanta has the largest wealth gap of the nation. And so, I would go from communities with, multi-million-dollar homes to communities where I'm not clear that they always had power. Right. So just an extraordinary contrast, and trying to find ways to make sure that we serve both of those types of constituents has been an interesting challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about just like what your legislative priorities are, especially as we come out of COVID. I mean, it's okay just to say my priorities are just to try to get everybody back on their feet again. But I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about just kind of what your hopes are these days.
Yeah, I mean, so I live in a state that has less than 35% of our folks
Oh
vaccinated.
man, that's not good.
That is not good, and so certainly that is a high priority for many of us, is to get those numbers up substantially. And we just have a lot of vaccination discernment, I believe is what we're calling it now. A lot of people are still discerning, and so we need to be really proactive on that issue. But I care about a lot of things: access to healthcare, criminal justice reform. Like, I have these kind of broad issues that I'm really passionate about. But I learned in my first year that you really have to narrow in, like, and focus very specifically on an area. And the area that I've kind of carved out is around protecting women. I had a piece of legislation passed this year that allows people who are victims of stalking. Men do get stalked, but the vast majority of people are women. Victims of stalking will now be able to get out of their lease and move,
Mm,
so they don't have to pay the penalties. That's one of the ways we've learned, when women are killed, they're often killed by somebody they know, and they're often killed by somebody who was stalking them before they killed them.
mm.
And so being able to get out of their leases is huge. And then this session, I'll come around and I'll also offer an opportunity. Hopefully, we'll pass some legislation where people will be able to get a protective order, or what we kind of colloquially call a restraining order, if they are a victim of sexual assault. So right now in Georgia, the only way you can get a restraining order against somebody is if it's domestic violence or if they're stalking you. But there's this kind of whole other category of people who really they need a judge to tell somebody, you need to stay away from me. So I'm going to offer that legislation this session as well.
No, that's great. My wife also worked with victims of domestic violence and the Violence Against Women's Act. And we're back in her old beat where she worked for the public interest law in our old town, and it's a way to save women's lives. That's such an important ministry. And you're right. I mean, people are so vulnerable. Of course, it's so obvious to think that someone might not be able to move because they can't afford to give up their down payment on the lease or the rental agreement. And what a terrible thing to think that because they didn't have that money, they lost their life.
Right.
One of the things we have just like our massive issue in San Francisco is just homelessness. And our mayor, London Breed, is adamant about it. But if you had like $1 billion, like what would you do about homelessness in a place like San Francisco or Atlanta?
I can talk about Atlanta because that's where I live and work.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to do, if you think of any like ways you can
I
transfer
don't-
your knowledge to us, then add those as little footnotes.
yeah, sure. Well, here's what I've learned. So the city of Atlanta and Georgia received millions of dollars in CARES funding, and we rapidly rehoused over 1,000 people within about a 3-month span. And what I learned is that if we had $1 billion, we could put everybody in a house. And I think that's really, I mean, it's housing first is
Yeah,
the
right.
model that we use. And I think it really does work. What I found, so about 50% of my parishioners, pre-COVID are now housed. And they still come to church. They still come to all of our, kind of programming because we are their community, but we're also the place where they get food and where they get other resources. And so, some would argue that you shouldn't put people in houses unless they're going to be able to have food and they're going to have access to the caseworkers and stuff like that. My parishioners don't care. They are just glad that they have a roof over their head, and
Yeah.
they are happy to come out and find these other additional resources along the way. So, we build homes, and I suspect this may be an issue in San Francisco, but certainly in Atlanta, that does mean that we're going to have to share our land. We're going to have to increase, so we'll have to change our zoning laws to increase density and population because people want to live in cities. And right now, we just simply don't have enough housing at all. So, maybe I won't get to stay on my 5 acres by myself anymore. And that's okay, right? Like, that's okay if that means that people aren't sleeping outside anymore.
Yeah, yeah, it's a heartbreaking problem that we face as a society. And I try to explain to my children that just was not like this as when I was a child. It's just an escalating problem that we really need to do something about. You've become like much more politically active just during such a volatile time, just with Donald Trump's presidency. And I wonder if you can just talk about just how Donald Trump's presidency looks different to you now than it did, say, like a year ago.
Yeah. So I didn't I think everybody knew we all kind of theoretically know that rhetoric had been heightened, that people were getting emboldened to be more overtly racist, overtly homophobic, overtly whatever. I think we all kind of knew in our head. But when I got elected and was told by the Capitol Police that I should not get the special tags because all senators are entitled to a car tag that says senator, right? It says
Yeah.
you're a senator and your number. When I was advised that it would not be safe for me to get that car tag, suddenly I understood differently, right? It became a whole lot more real, and the implications, right? All of us have had to have additional security throughout this year as a result of this. I mean, I live in Georgia where, we had to count our votes 3 times, right? So all of these things have happened because of President Trump, our former President Trump. But I think on this other side, now that we have a new president and we're kind of in a different place, I'm optimistic that that the security details that we've had will no longer be necessary, and I do think that we're going to see hopefully some ramping down of the language, right? Like the hate speech has been awful. Like I just finally could not read ever any comments on anything because people. It's interesting. I don't know. Like people feel like they have a license. If you're an elected official, you must not have a heart or you must not have a soul. So we can just call you anything and say anything about you. And I hope that changes.
Yeah, me too. I remember just reading, I can't remember if it was Michelle Obama's memoirs or Barack Obama's memoirs, just talking about just, the birther conspiracy, for instance, just like how much danger that kind of talking puts people in. And yeah, I can imagine just personally, it's much more personal when, for you, the person who's is targeted, it's a terrible thing. Yeah, I think you're right too. I think a lot of our media landscape just seems so polarized, and it does seem like people are able to inhabit a world where we're a falsehood, basically. where there's all these questions about the vaccine that aren't real questions, and that deoxychloroquine or whatever is regarded as like a real. Just verifiably false information that has become part of major news broadcasts and part of the major landscape, which I think is also I just don't even know what to do about it. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too, just the new technologies for communication, and how do we learn how to use, the internet is so new. I don't think we completely understand how to use social media and the internet. Maybe you have some ideas about that.
Yeah, well, so I came up in an age where so I'm a digital native, right? I'm young enough to have almost always had the internet. I don't really remember a time without it. And so I remember very specifically having classes in high school where they taught you how to tell if a website was real and had factual information or not. And I think that I'm clear, there are a lot of people who are older than me who never got that class. There are probably people who are my age and younger who didn't get that class either. But I think that's actually really key. Like we need to, so here's a simple example of something that actually doesn't really matter. But it's telling. So we had a senator who wanted to make the pecan the Georgia nut. Like, every state has a nut, right?
Yeah.
He wanted to make the pecan a Georgia nut. And so I just did a little Google research and, went to .edu, .edu real, websites to learn that a pecan is not a nut. It's a fruit.
Right.
Or
peanuts should be the nut of Georgia if it was a nut, right?
Right. If it was a nut. But so he, though, in turn, sends me back this, this website that's pecanusa.com. And I'm like, these people are trying to sell pecans. Of course they're going to tell you it's a nut.
Exactly.
But he could not discern the difference. And he felt so certain. He saw me as this young, can I cuss on this? I don't know. Young jerk.
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah. And he saw me as this young jackass who was telling him that his information was false. But I'm just yes, because you're not using a reputable website. So we need to teach people some internet, literacy is important. And I don't know what we do. I have parishioners who will not get the vaccine because they saw a TikTok video where somebody held a magnet to their, where they got the injection and it stuck there. I don't know how to combat that.
Yeah.
Other than to say hey, let's put a magnet on my arm and see if it sticks. Right. But there's just so many different ways for people to get information. And until we really do some true literacy around how do you tell fact from fiction, how do you dig through these pieces, then we're just going to be in real trouble.
Yeah, I totally agree. One of our traditions that we have at Grace Cathedral in the Forum is we take questions from our viewers. And so I just want to encourage anyone to if you have a question, then put it in the chat and Rebecca will text it to me. But one of the questions I have right here is from somebody. It says, what is the experience of being a minister and senator like in this violently divided body politic? What a great question.
Yeah.
2 thumbs up for whoever sent that to us.
I got to guess about that. So it is, it's complicated. I think that here in Georgia, generally speaking, people who are pastors or who are clergy tend to come from a particular conservative background and have a really conservative lens. And so my arrival on the floor with a not conservative lens has been shocking to people. I remember, I'm when you come out, you have to come out over and over again, right? Coming out is a process. And I assume that some of my colleagues aren't reading the same newspapers that I am. So despite all the media about my election, I knew that there would be colleagues who did not know that I was queer. But when they discovered it, that process of finding out, and it was a whisper campaign, they were just wait, you clergy and you gay? Hold up. Okay, I'm okay with it. But it just, they just had to kind of work through it. Yeah. And I was worried that finding out that I was queer would usurp their respect of me being clergy, and they actually do respect me as a minister. But what I found is that I think either they forgot that I was gay, or that that the way that I speak and the way that I engage with them, I mean, really, I treat folks as I treat them like they're my parishioners in many ways, in terms of just like, I am kind, I am respectful. I will listen. I will listen to somebody rant for an hour, because that's what we do.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of trumped it. That's perhaps a bad word, but that's kind of overshadowed my queerness. But I think it has been complicated, and people are really struggling to figure out how do they continue to use this language that they've used around Christianity that has been used to back conservative traditions. How do they counter that with this like Black woman with dreadlocks who can use Christian language to call us to expand Medicaid for all, right? And it's a complicated world. But I will say, being in the Georgia Senate, like, there are only 56 of us. And so we actually get a chance to know each other. And I think that helps. So on the outside, there is like a lot of, we're very black and white, right? Like, they're Republicans and the Democrats, and we hate each other. But actually on the inside, when we're actually on the Senate floor, or when we're in each other's offices, those divides aren't there. Those aren't real. And that's been actually really, really helpful for me to experience.
I think a lot of ordinary people that just gives us a lot of hope. I mean, I had a lobbyist in one of my churches who had a very strong political position, but he had a lot of respect for anyone who became a senator. I mean, the amount of intelligence and charisma and thoughtfulness and care you had to have. I mean, it helped people just not, like you said, to demonize people or to dehumanize them. One of the things I keep thinking about too, I mean, you must hear too from queer people who just like really look to you as inspiration, as somebody who can kind of, I don't know, we all have our dark nights of the soul. And I wonder if you can talk about just hearing from people who your path has really lifted up and sustained.
Yeah, so I will say every dark day that I've had on the Georgia Senate floor, and I think particularly around the passing of voting rights that aren't voting rights.
Yeah,
right?
that was killed us.
That day, we knew that it was going to pass, and that all we could do was try to stand up. But this young woman walked through. I was on break, and this woman walked through my offices, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, are you here? Is this Kim Jackson?" And I was like, "Yes, hi." And she started crying and just talked about how much it meant to her that there was somebody who loved like she does representing her on that Senate floor.
Oh, thanks be to God.
The timing of that was so perfect because I felt so powerless, right? Like, I knew we were going to pass this bill that was going to disenfranchise so many people. And so to have her, show up on that day and just testify, is what we would call it where I come from, right? Testify about what it means to see me was just so incredibly important, and I think helped sustain me through the rest of the day. And then my favorite story to tell about this. So, I grew up in that small little town, and so I had a young woman who's a teenager. She's in high school. She actually is at my high school where I went to high school.
That's great.
So she messaged me on Instagram, and she said, I just want you to know that it's really, really hard to be out in our high school, but seeing you has let me know that maybe I can still do something good in the world, even though these people tell me that I can't.
Oh my gosh, that is so beautiful.
It was just, I mean, so definitely my favorite story. And, I ended up writing my high school principal and saying like, hey, can I help us?
Right, completely.
Why is it 2020 and I've got, a girl writing me and saying that the school is really homophobic and that she doesn't have any safe places to go and no teachers? Like, how can I help? Right.
Yeah, exactly. What can we do together to make this a more loving environment for everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that story is just, that was just such a gift for all of us. Okay. There's so many people are sending in questions. Okay. Did you attend Emory for seminary? So we know that you didn't.
I did. No, I went to Candler School of Theology.
You went to Canada. Oh yeah, that's right. How
It's
did you choose to be an Episcopal priest? My brother and my nephew attended Morehouse. Did you meet anyone with the last name Booth?
That's
did you meet
awesome.
any Booths? And then why did you decide to become an Episcopal priest?
Yeah. So I did. I went to Emory, and this says Candler School of Theology for my first 3 years. That's where my MDiv comes from, and then I have a Anglican Studies degree from
Virginia. That's right.
Virginia.
Now I get it. Sorry.
Yeah. So I don't know anybody with the last name Booth. That comes to the top of my head. And I ended up being an Episcopal priest because, I mean, let's think about the time that I was emerging. So it was the early kind of the aughts, the mid 2000, 2005, 2006. And I was Black, I was a woman, and I was queer. And so my options for places that were going to ordain me with those identities were already pretty small. And so that actually was helpful because, if you only have 3 types of cereal to choose from, you can pick a lot faster. And so I really did. I mean, I had at the time, the only people who were ordaining out queer folks were the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and the United Church of Christ. Those were my 3 choices. And then, there's some non-denominational folks, but those were the main line. And so I went and explored those churches. I went to an Episcopal church, and it was my first time ever being in a context where people read their prayers.
Yes, right.
Right?
That's weird, isn't it?
It's very weird. The first time that I've ever been in a context where everything was written down, it's all very weird. But what wasn't weird was this moment when it was time to have what I would have called communion back then, right? What we call Eucharist. Despite having never grown up, ever seeing smells and bells, and I'd never seen those robes or anything, there was something deep in my soul that connected with this old white-haired white guy standing up chanting this ancient, what sounded ancient to me, liturgy. And it penetrated me so deeply of, this feels right. Even though I'd never experienced it before, it just felt right deep in my soul. And so that sent me exploring further, right? I think having that kind of pivotal moment and then learning that we do it every Sunday, what?
This is great.
Amazing. So, I don't really get the organ music like this, 15 years ago, that's what I was saying. I don't really get the organ music and it's a whole lot of white people. I don't get all that, but I get communion and they do it every Sunday. And it's so beautiful. And it's so it's just so, it's like we really believe that something powerful is happening in that moment. And it just spoke to me. And so I was like, all right, let me do this. I want to do this for the communion.
Oh, I love that story. I feel the same way. I feel the same way every week. People come up and the chance that we get to share this bread with each other. I mean, at Grace Cathedral, you can smell the bread because it was just baked that morning. I mean, you stand at the altar and you're saying the communion, and then people come up and you're able to give, I didn't make the bread. I didn't set up the cathedral. I didn't do anything, but I get to be part of that exchange of, and you see on their faces, everybody's, something's happening to them really big. I feel the same way every week.
Yeah. It never gets old.
Never gets old. Never gets old. Okay, here's another question. I know a gay Episcopal priest, a woman, who says that it's often harder to reveal that she's a Christian than a lesbian. Have you ever experienced that?
I suspect that person lives in California.
I was going to say the same thing.
Or not in the South.
Yeah.
No, so it's interesting. I will say, and kind of generally, no, it's harder for me to come out as a lesbian than it is a Christian. In fact, in general conversation, people assume I'm a Christian. That's kind of how it works. But the exception to that was when I was on the campaign trail. So when I was on the campaign trail, people were really skeptical of, you're clergy, but you also care about women's issues. is that possible? Right? Like there was this kind of mind, like people couldn't really wrap their head around me both being clergy, then like throw in lesbian, but also being progressive. That all didn't really fit into their puzzle piece. So I think that's probably the most clear moments where I've had people just kind of question and me be hesitant. I mean, I am an Episcopal priest, like that's what I do is my day job. But I know sometimes when I was on the campaign trail, I would talk about like, well, I work with people who are experiencing homelessness, right? And I wouldn't necessarily define that I was a clergy person because it made people so suspect of my progressive views. Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest problems. There's a dominant Christian culture, and there's ways in which we're so against the grain. It's just very hard to communicate that. I mean, we had a van parked in front of our church this week that basically had this huge thing. It was basically addressed to the archbishop. And of course, we don't even have an archbishop. It was all about clergy sexual abuse that happens in a totally different church. We're like constantly, it's hard to be able, and to me, it makes all those things that you say completely make sense. I mean, that's what Jesus says, that's what the kingdom of God is, and yet I don't, in this national setting, it's sometimes just really hard to communicate. Okay, here's another question that we have coming in. Oh, any suggestions on how Christians can help tone down the rhetoric? Even in California, there are red and blue streams in the parishes. I'm so interested in the church in the public square. Can you say more?
Yeah, so I think that some of the ways for us to tone down the rhetoric is to model that, right? Is to practice our own ability to engage and have these conversations without this kind of heightened rhetoric. I just did a forum at a church, at an Episcopal church here in Atlanta, where we were talking about Black Lives Matter and whether or not they could have a sign out in front of it, and that term Black Lives Matter has become extraordinarily politicized, and there were people there who expressed some clear opinions about the political nature of that term, and my job was to just kind of keep bringing us back, like bringing us down, like bringing us back and bringing us back to community and what it means to be church and who we're called to be in terms of followers of Jesus, right? So I think some of it's just practicing it and it's modeling it. And then the other piece of it, I think that it's really, really important for people of faith who identify as progressives or who have more progressive or more liberal beliefs about how we might live and govern with one another. It's really important for us to go and talk about that and say, as a person of faith, right? So like when you go and speak at the city council and tell them that critical race theory is a totally great thing that we should be teaching people, preface it with as a person of faith, because that's how we start changing how people, that's how we change the dominant narrative, right? The dominant narrative is that Christians are, first of all, they ain't queer, right? Christians, they're not women clergy. Like there are all these assumptions and stereotypes about what Christians are. And as long as we don't claim boldly that we are also Christians, then that narrative just gets dominated. So for me, I'll give an example though of like faith in the public square. I've been really clear about the need for Medicaid for all and really Medicaid expansion here in Georgia is the specific issue. And I talk about a Jesus who went and he healed people without, like, they didn't have to ask. I mean, this is actually my sermon on Sunday. Like she didn't even ask for it. Like she just got her healing, right? That Jesus freely gave Medicare, like gave medicine, gave care, gave healing to whomever asked for it. And so if we're going to follow in the way of Jesus, then that's the model. And I talk about it that way, right? I say, I am inviting us to follow the way of Jesus, a Jesus who gave medical treatment freely without any pause. You didn't have to pay for anything. You didn't have to believe a certain thing, right? Like you just got it. And I think that's a part of how we reshape and reframe what it means to be a person of faith who actually speaks up about these issues as it pertains to public policy.
Yeah, definitely. So who are some of your heroes? Just like, who are some of the people that you really look up to, either as a kid or even right now?
Yeah, so the first person that comes to mind is the Reverend Polly Murray.
Oh,
Um,
yes. Is she
yeah,
amazing? Loved it when Yale named one of the colleges after her. Did you see
yeah,
that?
I did
Oh,
see that.
she's amazing.
Yeah, so Polly Murray was the first African American woman ever ordained a priest in this church, and was also just this great legal mind, and just so really incredible. And we also understand that they were queer. Um,
Right. Completely.
and so when I was sworn in January, I wore a stole from Polly Murray that Polly Murray handed
Oh,
down
that's
to.
great. I
Yeah, right.
love that. That's so
Um,
cool.
and so I tell people, I feel like, we don't really have guardian saints in the Episcopal Church, but if I had one, it would be Polly Murray. Um, and I very much feel like when I'm like poring over policy, I'm like trying to channel like Polly Murray's really, she has such a sharp mind, right? And she read law with a lens towards equity and equality for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, that's how she read the law. And so I am trying to like channel her all the time when I'm reading policy, to think about like, does this help move us closer to equity? Does this help move us closer to inclusion? Right. So Polly Murray is definitely my like number one person right now. And then I have a mentor who was the first African American ever elected in the entire state to a state legislator in the entire nation. Her name is Simone Bell, and she paved the way for all of us 10 years ago as this kind of out queer woman who was, Black and doing her thing. And so she is a dear mentor of mine. I feel like I've learned so much from her. And on the hard days, she's the one that I get to call, and she's like, yeah, I've been there. But remember, when I was there, they wouldn't even ride in the elevator with me. So she just helps me. She helps me remember how far we've come, and also just helps support me and trying to help us move further.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so inspiring. I'm so glad, because you're such a path breaker yourself. I think it would be. I mean, it's good to have those connections to people who can build you up, because I can imagine all this would just it'd be tremendously wearing. I mean, I can imagine just having a bad day in the church and a bad day on the floor of the Senate, and just having them happen at the same time. And when you have bad days, they're really bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
I honestly cannot believe it, because it just seems like I just started talking with you, but it's actually we're like out of time. But I wonder if you could just tell us just some signs of hope that you see for us. I mean, you do a wonderful job of communicating hopefulness for the future and inspiring us. But what are you seeing as you kind of look at the world through your eyes nowadays?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, we elected more out queer people last cycle than we ever have in the history of the United States. I see that as a sign of hope. And that's for all elected offices, from the school board. My local school board is chaired by an out gay Black man, like in the South. I mean, if you can't have hope, Lynn, I mean,
Oh my gosh, I love that.
that's huge. So I mean that's one of the things. But I think I also find a lot of hope in so many this often young Black women who are on the grounds doing the hard work. When we look at Georgia, and we had more people vote last year than ever in the entire history of Georgia, and that's because of the hard work and efforts of young Black, often queer women on the ground who've been doing that work. And so they're continuing to organize. I just left a meeting this morning where we're talking about how we're going to work through this law, and we're prepared. If we have to bring scanners to everybody's door, we will do it. Right. Like, we've got an army of folks lined up to help make sure that that nobody gets disenfranchised. And I find so much hope in that, right? So much hope in people's deep commitment to our democracy. Right, that they are willing to start planning months and months in advance because we care about our democracy. We care about the democratic process of making sure people get to vote. And then finally, the last piece of hope that I will offer is that I am hearing more and more progressive people of faith standing up and speaking out as clear about being people of faith, whether they're Christians, whether they're Muslims or Jewish. I'm seeing more and more people, particularly in the South, standing up and saying, I am a person of deep faith, and we need to do this work to love our neighbor well, and that means we expand Medicaid. Right. I am a deep person of faith, and that means that we need to love our neighbor well by increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So I'm deeply encouraged by that.
Yeah, I've got to say, you give me so much hope, Kim. You're really on the front lines. You're incredibly courageous and brave and thoughtful and caring. And I just really do sense that God is working through you to just to build the kingdom. And it makes me feel so good to know that folks like you are out there. And I thought so much more of our conversation would be about that last election in Georgia when we first planned this. But it's a good way for us to finish off, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah. Well, everybody, please join us for next week when our guest will be Deanna Van Buren. She's one of only 500 Black female architects in the US and founder of Designing Justice and Designing Spaces, whose bold idea is that by transforming the spaces and places where we do justice, we can transform the culture of justice in our society. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or by texting THINK, T-H-I-N-K, to 76278. And Kim, we're going to keep you in our prayers as you're out there on the front lines. And I can't wait till you find yourself in San Francisco and we can walk around this beautiful city. And if I'm in Atlanta, I won't be there for a long time. But if I come down now there, I'll let you know that I'm in town.
Please
Thanks
do.
so much for everything, and God bless.
God bless him.
Good night, everyone.